Okay, we have a presentation from Rob, and Rob is going to talk about, the title of his talk was Indigenous Opportunity Considerations within the Faro Mine Remediation Project. So, take it away.
Thank you, appreciate it. Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is great. My name is Rob Yeomans. I work for Parsons Inc., and they've recently got the contract for the Faro Mine Remediation Project. So just a few minutes to kind of go through the project and near the end start to focus on some of our socioeconomic strategy and how Indigenous opportunity considerations are used to sort of bring that forward. So let's begin. So just some acknowledgements first. Acknowledging the Ta'an Quechin Council and the Kwanlun First Nation for having us here this week, and also to the Ross River Dana Council, where our project resides on their traditional territory. So just a quick rundown of the project, just basically an overview. So for those that don't know the Faro project, it's up in Faro, Yukon, about 350 kilometers northeast of Whitehorse here. It's an open pit mine that ran from about 1969 to 1998. At the time, in its heyday, it was probably the largest, or it was one of the largest lead zinc producing mines in the world, and height supplying 15% of global output. So it's a huge site. Oh, I lost my guy here. Okay, I'll come back over here. So yeah, just a massive site and a lot of historic mining practices that you wouldn't see nowadays. In 1998, the mine was abandoned and eventually ended up in the care of the federal government, who is our client, Canada. Canada splits this project into two departments essentially to manage it. There's CERNAC, which manages a lot of the socioeconomic stuff that I deal with, and PSPC, which is more of the procurement and contracting side of it. So our client is sort of split in two in that sense. Parsons, we received the care and maintenance contract in 2016, carried that through, and then we now received the main construction manager contract in 2022 and are doing that now, as well as the care and maintenance contract. So let's get going. So this is essentially a look of the mine site that we're working on. There's another section of Van Gorda that goes farther down a road, but generally this is the site. The site is about the size of Victoria, British Columbia, so it's very large, a lot of volume. We've got about 350 million tons of waste rock. You can see it up in there. And about 70 million tons of tailings running through there. The project, I just heard Minister Stryker talk about the temporal scope of projects and how the timeline is so important for communities. And the federal government recognized that in this project. And so we have a very long timeline to do this work, probably around 15 to 20 years, which is a significant timeline for the work. The work could have been done a lot shorter, I'm sure. But this gives us a lot of opportunity in the socioeconomic sphere. So the work generally will be, it's mainly a diversion of water. So any water that comes in contact with the site becomes contaminated because of acid rock drainage. And so a big part of the project is just diverting a lot of the natural streams that run through the site and diverting them around the site into the natural environment. They're going to use essentially a stabilize in place method for the project. So all of that 350 million tons of waste rock will be reformed into landscape, recovered, and revegetated. Sounds quite simple, but when you think about doing that to Victoria, BC, you start to see the scale that we're having to deal with. We also have a bunch of historic structures, so the mill and so on, that are condemned and contaminated. So those all have to be dealt with as well. But generally, all of the site that touches, or all of the water that touches the site, we then have to deal with that. And we essentially deal with that by funneling all of the water that hits the site into the Faro pit, and that's the big lake you see there on the right. And once we get it in that pit, that's basically where we collect it, and then we pump it into water stations throughout the site. Next year, we'll be starting what we call the permanent water treatment plant. It's a very large, permanent water plant being built here. It's about a 3 to 4 year project, hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll hopefully be starting that in the spring. Lots of activity on site in the last few years. It changes every time I come visit. So the location of a project is really important, particularly in the area of socioeconomics. In this case, our project sits within the Cascadene Traditional Territory. It sits within Ross River's unceded traditional territory, as they are the closest impacted community of all the Casca Nations within that area. So it's a big area, and it encompasses a lot of Casca Nations. Ross River being the closest, again, proximity to mine, the impacts, historic impacts that happen to the community, they tend to be considered, or what we consider them, a lead community for the project. When we looked at sort of the economic reconciliation for the project, this was essentially the pathway that we worked with our client to sort of create. A lot of engagement. And again, this takes time. Engaging a community here and there at a couple of evenings, that doesn't quite do it anymore. I think communities are asking for a lot more. So we certainly have a lot of hiring that we do in the community. We have an office set up in the community. I'm up there quite a bit, visiting. And a lot of the times it's not necessarily for a meeting. It's not necessarily for an objective that we're trying to do. It's simply to be in the community for one of their events or knock on some doors, talk to some people. So those relationships need to be authentic. As a consultant for the federal government, we play in almost all of these spaces, except, I guess, the project governance and committees. That's more of a government aspect. But all of these other areas, I think you need to touch on if you're looking into that. So how do we make that happen? Through our socioeconomic strategy for the project. It's a short-term and long-term strategy looking out across 15 years, basically cut up into 2-year chunks and revised every 2 years according to what needs to get done. The main focus of our strategy is, of course, because we're a project and we're on the implementation side, it's all about training, employment, subcontracting, and procurement. And we do that in a number of different ways. So one of the big ways we get to that, reaching that economic reconciliation is through what we call Indigenous opportunities considerations. So these are essentially contracting mechanisms that we put in place for all of our work packages on site, which is around, we've been averaging about 50 to 60 million a year. And of those work packages that are happening, each of the contractors have to basically, with their bid, submit a commitment or a guarantee of training, employment, subcontracting, and procurement. And they can hit high on some of those and low on others. But generally what we're looking for is those that can make the boldest commitments that they can actually meet. They start out with the highest amount of points moving through the evaluation. So we're really trying to encourage a lot of these larger companies that deal with these large-scale projects. We're really trying to encourage them to reach into the communities and use the community's resources that they have in employment, offering training that's certifiable, that's directly related to our project. And to date, it's been quite successful in most cases. So looking a little deeper into those, I just said there was a mechanism that we use. They are shifting all the time. So there's we constantly use a continual feedback loop when we're dealing with our work packages. So we'll post the bid, people will come out and bid on it, we'll do the evaluation, and we'll look at that process and adjust it to suit for the next work package, because we're doing quite a few work packages annually on this project. So depending on what the scope of work is, depending on what the scale is, those commitments start to change. But the focus is always on having the subcontractor making those commitments and meeting them. And we sort of enforce that in the penalties and bonuses that we offer those contractors when they've completed their work packages. So a bit of an incentive. It has created a bit of competition among a lot of the consulting firms, a lot of the construction firms that are coming up to work. There's a lot of activity in that area. I'm sure you've talked to hear about BMC and fireweed and everyone else in that area. So that's something we're keeping an eye on, because we don't want necessarily these smaller communities to be bombarded by a competitive spirit in the community. We kind of want something that's a little more manageable. So when we look at sort of obtaining work at the site, these are often very large work packages. So we're trying to deal with that by bringing smaller work packages onto site. We are very much interested in facilitating partnerships and joint ventures between some of the development corporations, Casca development corporations, and the companies that are coming up to work. Networking and relationships are an excellent way for a smaller company to get larger, or an individual to build upon himself to build a company. So that's what we're trying to do as much as we can. The way we look at it is, if we can take a small company who wants to scale up, and we partner them with a company that's already scaled up, and those two work together on this project, there's going to be a lot of learning that takes place, and a lot of development and capacity growth. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Can you be a supplier for the project? Of course, there's all sorts of things that are supplied on this. A lot of them are pretty large in volume, but we have an entire project website that I'll go through later that sort of looks into a lot of that, and you can go in there and find specifically what we need. All of our contracts go to mercs.com, so it's a wide open process globally, but we certainly have an office here in Whitehorse and a lot of supports for any local resources that come into our office. So I recognized I was presenting just before lunch, so that's that. But I wanted to give it an opportunity for questions or any comments. You know, I don't know to what extent they've looked at reprocessing tailings. I do know that they've looked at Van Gorda as it's another part of the project farther down the road, and I think that's still a viable mining project. But in terms of reprocessing, I don't think so. There's a lot of the guys that are working on site, and there's a lot of historic surprises on site, which makes work a little more challenging. But great question. Sure.
My company, Global Construction, does quite a few contracts up at the Faro mine site.
Sure do.
A lot of our employees are First Nations. In order to qualify for these IOC commitments on labor hours, it specifies that they must reside within the Casca territory. Many of those people have moved to Whitehorse, to further the kids' education if they're in high school, or just through time have sort of moved and aren't going to move back for one job.
Right.
One 4-month job, 6-month job. So they're actually being, and it's a small thing at the end of the day, but I mean, their labor hours are not actually counted, and they're sort of saying, well, I didn't bother to go back to work there. I can choose, I can go work anywhere.
Yeah.
To work there. So they're sort of, feeling a bit slated that they don't even count as, a Ross River Denny council citizen as far as the contract goes, when they were born and raised there, but just moved to Whitehorse or moved elsewhere and are coming back to work there.
Right.
So just for going forward and start administratively from your end, from Parsons end, to manage that there has to be a line somewhere, I get. But just in these contracts, we've had that several people, Watson Lake citizen, count as well. So it's real tough to manage that, and on the reporting end of it, you always, submit all these hours and they end up getting bumped back and sort of X'd off the list. Nope, sorry, that person didn't count.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, and that's a very good point. And we were very conscious about that need, and even the validity of, a Cascadena citizen or not. So it's certainly a challenge for us and yourself, I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned that the waste rock will be recapped and some remediation will be done on it.
Yeah.
I was wondering what cities or preliminary cities have been convicted to capture the nation's interest and input about the remediation work. Very often our definition of success regarding remediation, which is challenged by the gold standard of the Yukon, is different from the First Nations definition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our client recognized that early on, and while it's not our project, but I know they work with other consulting companies to do a revegetation program for the site, And so if you come to our site, you'll see entire slopes of different types of plants being planted every year. And these are all planted by the Ross River Dene Council and their members. And almost every year they come back. And the seeds that they gathered for that revegetation program came from their traditional territories and were collected by their community. So a very strong connection to that. That was certainly recognized. Yeah. And that even goes as far as, you know, the landscaping and that type of thing, like the structure of the land. Yeah. Yeah.
Talking about the opportunity that Small Mine Project has for longer-term initiatives with training and skills development. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what's being done and what's been successful so far?
Sure. I mean, we have a number of different levels, I guess, of strategy for that. We target individuals with an interest. So if there was a mechanic in the community that had an interest but needed their schooling, you know, we brought them into the project, started get them as a in training mechanic, scope out apprenticeship pathways for them, and then that thinking scales up all the way to, say, for care and maintenance. So our care and maintenance contract is essentially a group of tradespeople that manage everything on site, fix things, build things. These are all occupations that are well suited to a very diverse group. And so the big plan is that care and maintenance contract, because this permanent water treatment plant is permanent, that the community would actually be running that plant. It's years to get there, right, through training, and you have to have certifications, and water treatment is a pretty technical field, but we're building in that direction. Yeah. Right. Well, you're right. That's a great question. So she just asked, how do we deal with racism on site and within the project? We have an Indigenous awareness course that we provide every employee that starts on our project. It's part of their orientation. We bring a lot of that to site. So people that are on site, we have meetings every morning with the group. Those presentations and that type of education is often given there. We hold, I mean, Parsons as a company, of course, has harassment policies and this type of thing that are very strict. But I gotta say, when it comes down to it, it's about project culture and company culture. And I would say at Parsons, that culture is very strong. And that type of attitude just doesn't fit with our project.
Thank you for bringing that up, Ruth. I always maintain that racism is the fundamental barrier to equity.
No, it's true. Yeah, and I think that's an area that a project continually has to develop and work on. It's not something you can just sit back and say, oh, we're good. I think that's something you always have to be looking at, yeah.
So what do you do to empower your team to speak up against racism, to speak up against stuff like that?
Basically, it's a zero tolerance policy at Parsons. Like on our site, if those, you know, if racial slurs or whatever are given, it's dealt with right away. It's dealt with in that moment.
So many people are afraid to come forward because of the fear of repercussions.
Yeah.
And it's true, it happens, we see it every day.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Which, again, why we have to sort of look at that ongoing. But no, I think it becomes part of that culture on site. And that's something management and executives can deal with and enforce. And they certainly do on our site. The other thing we're looking at and through our strategy is sort of how do you make your work site a comfortable place for someone from a small community? Right? That's one option.
It gives the people a safe avenue to go to report safety, environmental. It gives people a safe avenue to do that.
Yeah.
You know, and if your best interests are fair treatment and the environment, you should encourage it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It'll give you people the brings forward what's important in workers.
Yeah. Well, and it just creates better work, frankly. You know, better team, better work. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's, you know, and again, when we were building that permanent water treatment plant, we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we make this area welcoming to the Ross River Dana Council and members. So it's on the forefront. One more there in the back, yeah. Yeah, very much. I mean, it brings opportunities for the entrepreneur, but it also brings a lot of challenges for a community. In the Faro project, that was recognized fairly early, and they are building a permanent camp outside of town, halfway up our access road to the mine. And the intent of that is to basically all contractors will have to stay there unless you move to Faro, and then you can, you know, have a house and rent and that kind of thing. But generally, we're conscious of that, and we're trying to keep the transient workforce and the large companies that come in for work packages to stay at that camp, which should be open in the spring. I think that's 200, 180 beds by the end. But yeah, there's a, I mean, with a project this size and the history that it has, there's a lot going on for sure. Gender goals? How do you mean? Right, certainly. Yeah, we actually have a fairly high percentage of women. Most of our executive team is women, so that's constantly on their radar, I think. We also keep statistics on gender in our project, so when those numbers start to fall, we see it on a monthly basis. So certainly pay attention to that. Yeah. Yeah. And the project, the scale of that project, it's not, our work packages tend to be, you know, trucks and people on site, but there's a lot of work that goes on outside of that as well. All right, well, thank you everyone. I appreciate the time.
So thanks everybody for sitting through the presentations. I think there were some great ones. And lunch, I think everybody's probably hungry, so grab yourself some lunch.